Well, hello, I'm Dennis McCuistion, and welcome to another program with my co-host, Jim Falk. Jim, how are you?
I'm doing very well. Good to see you.
Thank you. And for you, our viewer, corruption is a topic we don't talk about a lot on this program, but we're going to talk about Afghanistan and corruption. There are a lot of people, including our two guests, who believe that that is one of the major problems that happened in Afghanistan that led to, let's just say, less than a perfect result. We did a show years ago and we quoted a Pinkerton study that said 30% of all people will steal and actively look for it. 40% will steal if they get an opportunity, and only 30% will not steal under any circumstances. We had Mary Ann Jennings on, which you probably saw in the past, and she said that number that won't steal today is 10%. And by the way, that's in America, not in Afghanistan. So, Jim, why don't you introduce our two guests and let's see what role corruption may have played in this particular issue.
Sarah Chayes' career has taken her as an NPR correspondent from Paris, France, to covering the Taliban and really the first downfall of the Taliban after we went in 2001 and 2002. She also then went and stayed in Kandahar, where she, with a group of women, created and established a soap factory. Really quite an amazing story about her. She then went on to advise our military as a consultant, and particularly on the subject of corruption. She worked for Admiral Mullen when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and we're going to hear about some of the successes as well as the failures. She's an accomplished author of a number of articles and two books that I found particularly interesting. One was Thieves of State: Why Corruption Threatens Global Security. And our most recent book, and this is one really to think about, Corruption in America and What is at Stake. She's joined by an accomplished civil servant of Usaid, the United States Agency for International Development. Rebecca Mark had a career of over 3 decades with USAID. And in a sense, she really does know about successes as well as failures. She served as the deputy director of USAID in Kabul from 2009 to 2010, and this was one of many posts that she had throughout the world. Ben Rhodes, President Obama's deputy national security director, recently spoke at the World Affairs Council in Dallas about corruption and the impact that it had on the fall of the Afghan government. We'll be hearing from him as well. Sarah, welcome again to the program.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
And tell us, give us 2 or 3 examples of the most really endemic problems that you saw with corruption in Afghanistan that brought us to the point we are now.
I mean, it was every interaction with a government official. So imagine your father got blown up in a remotely controlled bomb. You need the death certificate. You have to pay a bribe to get your father's death certificate. Imagine you're a former police officer. Now you have an auto parts store. You are being shaken down by police, once every 5 or 10 miles. And then you finally get sick of it and you say, no, I'm not, I've paid my customs dues. I've paid 10 or 15 of your colleagues. I'm not paying you also. And you get smacked in the face. So I think that last one is important because we think about how much money it is and we talk about petty corruption. But what's really important to recognize is it's not just the loss of money, it's the loss of dignity. It's the humiliation that people suffered when they were also being extorted. And you think about, this is in Kandahar, which had been the Taliban heartland. It's pretty hard not to join the Taliban if you're a young man in Kandahar. So how angry, does the government want to make people? And then I would just add to that Afghanistan is a place where people know things. A lot of people aren't literate, but in a strange way, it means they know even more because they know who's who, and they know who went to what school, and or didn't go to any school. And then they watch them driving around in $50,000, $70,000, $80,000 cars, and they know that the reconstruction money is not reaching the ordinary people. It's not reaching who it ought to reach. And in a sense, that makes them angrier at the Reconstruction than if it weren't even being done at all.
I think corruption is the most important factor to get at if you want to promote democracy and combat autocracy, because they rely on corruption to finance their politics, but they also rely on the cynicism that corruption engenders to make these arguments. You can't really change anything.
And it makes it a lot easier, obviously, for them to be encouraged to join the Taliban, no doubt. One of the big issues that people have been talking about here in the United States is, why didn't the Afghan military stand up? And the corruption that you have written about among generals and also really at all levels of the military makes it quite understandable why people laid down their arms. Tell us more about that.
So I would say there are two reasons. One is that, as you just suggested, this type of corruption was pervasive within the Afghan military also. And that meant, number one, that the military was often abusing the population, so they didn't have much local support. And then secondly, that, the supposed 300,000 soldiers were not 300,000 soldiers. There were 300,000 names on, rosters, but then their commanding officers were collecting their pay. And there were not anything like that many people on the ground. And the same thing went for materiel, and the same thing went for medical services for the military, and the same thing went for even food or pay. And that money was making its way up the line. So that's the other thing to understand, is the system was vertically integrated, meaning whatever was extorted or stolen at the ground level, a part of it was being paid up the line, and it added up to a lot of money. Like in 2010, according to two different surveys, something between $2 and $5 billion a year in extorted bribes. The second reason why people laid down their arms is because there was a lot of negotiating going on. In other words, once in 2018, the United States government said very clearly, we are in the process of negotiating to get out of Afghanistan. That gave the Taliban 2 years to go pushing on people at every level, provincial governors, military commanders, police commanders. Look, the Americans are leaving anyway. You should join us. Look, the Americans are about to leave. So once there's a date, there was nothing in it for people to stay. In a way, the way we organized, the way the US government organized these negotiations beginning in 2018 was a gift to the Taliban. It gave them time to pursue the type of talks on a local level that are classic in Afghanistan. So we had our eyes on Doha, but the real negotiations were actually happening on the ground.
Yeah. So very interesting information from someone who was there and seeing it, Sarah. And Rebecca, you too were there, and especially in 2009, 2010. So before I ask you some specific questions about your experience, tell that viewer who may not be as familiar with USAID as others exactly what USAID is there to do and what specifically you were doing there.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim and Dennis. Well, USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development, is one of the three components of U.S. government's foreign policy. So we have diplomacy, defense, and USAID, and foreign assistance. USAID is not the only, but the largest implementer of foreign assistance. There's obviously the whole intelligence and apparatus as well, but officially those three Ds. And USAID is the smallest by far. I think in Afghanistan, when I was there, our budget was supposed to go up to, well, the assistance budget was supposed to go up to $4 billion, the majority, but not all of which was going to USAID, whereas the military was about 110 billion at the same time. So you're talking a very big difference. So the job of USAID is really to help countries under US foreign policy to help secure our interests by making countries stronger, essentially. Building up education, literacy, numeracy, employment opportunities, better governance, democratic principles, environmental protection, all sort of the basics of what people look for essentially from their government. So working in over 80 some countries, Afghanistan in that period was certainly the largest, that in Iraq were the largest presence. So a lot of money. I agree with Sarah that corruption is important. I think it's one of many reasons. I think killing people, probably when your sons and daughters are dying from drone attacks and military attacks, I think that also creates a huge lack of support for the Afghan government and the U.S. presence there. So but corruption is something that USAID spends a lot of time focused on, I think, because it's not primarily working in secured confidential communications. We get a whole lot of attention from a whole lot of people. And so the use of US government money that comes through USAID gets a lot of controls. We have our own inspector general, we had our own procurement process. USAID implements through really the people who work for them, like me, a foreign service officer, help design and procure design programs under the strategic direction that the U.S. foreign policy apparatus and process, which is very complicated in Afghanistan, but designs programs which are then implemented by contractors. Now, some of those are big U.S. contractors, some of them are big U.S. nonprofits like Save the Children, and increasingly, and this has been going on for most of my career, a focus on local Afghan organizations.
Let me jump in here, if I may, because I've just been reading Craig Whitlock's book, the Washington Post reporter, The Afghanistan Papers. And he quotes Ryan Crocker about a major USAID project, I think it was in Kandahar, and he said, we knew it wasn't going to work. I mean, when you look at something like that, how is the American taxpayer supposed to have any confidence in how we choose projects and where our money is spent?
I agree. I mean, those decisions were made by a lot of people. I think he's referring to Kajaki Dam power plant, if I'm correct. This took a lot of discussion at the highest levels with the generals, with the ambassadors, with Washington. So a whole lot of people making that decision. I think the question was, could you actually get it to function without it being attacked? And how many people would be killed in the process of getting that power plant, that dam built and the power plant built? And just personally, it's very, I'm a development person. That's what I care about, and making decisions where you know that there's going to be deaths as well as possibility of leaking money was very difficult. I don't really know. When I was there, that it wasn't clear that it wasn't going to work. There were a lot of questions about the ability to secure the process of construction as well as the alternative.
Yeah, Rebecca, let me interrupt you there for a second too. One of the things that you told me ahead of time, and maybe I have the numbers right, I think you told me in the projects that you work with that in many cases, 40% of your budget had to go to security, either paying American forces or American contractors or perhaps Afghan forces, just to keep things safe enough for people to work. Is that right?
For the big infrastructure projects in the conflict areas, yes. That was not true across the board. And again, that was the switch from moving out from Kabul into Helmand, Kandahar, Ghazni, where things were very kinetic, and you had major equipment. You also were flashpoint for attacks. So a lot of that money, that was not true across the board, but increasingly as the country became more and more violent in response to, I think, our increasing military presence, it was more expensive to do those projects.
The State Department, meanwhile, is tasked with trying to stand up an Afghan government that can kind of absorb this infusion of assistance, and there was nowhere to put all that aid. You know, they did. This is not a country with institutions. This is a country with a way of doing politics that has always been tribal and patronage based. And so, if you just dump in a lot more money, it doesn't stop being tribal and patronage based.
Sarah, you did so much work working with two commanders, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and the ideas and the structure that you had would have really made a difference, but you really got caught in this interagency warfare. We don't have a lot of time, but I really want you to talk about how the State Department and the military and the CIA often worked at cross purposes, and they didn't know what the left hand was doing, what the left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing.
Yes, and I would also, of course, we could have a back and forth about assistance and aid and infrastructure projects, and whether it even made sense at all to do try to rebuild a massive hydroelectric plant when there's abundant sunshine. I spent years before the Kajiki Dam project was underway trying to say, couldn't we do smaller modular solar? I mean, I think this is where we got into problems, is the large infrastructure we should have done very early, like the Kabul to Kandahar road. And then it didn't make sense to be supporting these massive targets, really. I mean, you just had to get closer to the ground. But, that was one of the debates. But as you say, on a higher level, what was fascinating to me was it was, in fact, the military that caught on to the importance of corruption and the impact it was having on the Afghan population, because they were closer to the ground. They just had more officers out there interacting with more people. And eventually, so I had a very difficult time persuading the civilian leadership, be it civilian within the Department of Defense. When I was working for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he sort of got this. He's like, wait a second, I'm an American, I'm here to help, is not registering with Afghans at the moment because they see us backing a government that every single day is interacting with them in an extortionate, hostile way. It's not very convincing. He got that, and somehow civilian leaders, both in the Department of Defense, especially in the State Department, were just not interested in this issue. I mean, their focus was Taliban targets who could be killed. So anyone who provided them with a target, they were willing, not anyone, but they were willing to pay him. And in particular, that meant Hamid Karzai, the president of the United States. So you had that meant Hamid Karzai, the president of Afghanistan. So you had this curious situation where the CIA station chief was having private conversations with the president of Afghanistan that the US ambassador didn't even know what was being said, that the CIA was sending bagfuls of money to the president of Afghanistan in the hands of an individual who was then the target of the first major US-Afghan combined anti-corruption investigation and prosecution. So you get the guy, judicial wiretaps, proof up and down the line, and basically the CIA steps in and tells Karzai, you don't have to worry about it, you can let him out of jail. That's no way to run a government.
Sarah, let me ask you this, and they run off to Dubai and buy mansions, I guess.
They run off to Dubai and buy mansions. They run off to London and buy mansions. They build things in Afghanistan that people can see. So it's all very visible. Often the United States is also a tremendous secrecy jurisdiction. So for example, President Karzai's brother, for whom I worked in the very first couple of years that I was in Afghanistan, our nonprofit was registered in Delaware. He lives in Baltimore. I lived in Paris. And I'm thinking, why is our organization registered in Delaware? Well, some years later, I learned that Delaware is one of the world's primary secrecy jurisdictions. So who knows what money he was running through the accounts of our NGO? I have no idea.
Obviously, most corporations are headquartered in Delaware, by the way. I don't want to get into why Woodrow Wilson caused that over 100 years ago, but that's another issue. I want to give you a definition of kleptocracy and see if this fits. And here's the definition. It's rule by thieves. And that ties into the name of your book, by the way. It's a system of governance where its officials and the ruling class in general pursue personal wealth and political power at the expense of the wider population. Now, in strict terms, kleptocracy is not a form of government, but a characteristic of a government engaged in such behavior. Yes or no, Sarah? That's what we have here.
I think that's what we have in Afghanistan.
Right, that's what I mean in Afghanistan. Yeah.
Well, but you phrased your question very interestingly, Dennis, because what I would like to say, and this is what I really came to understand writing my most recent book on corruption in America, is that Afghanistan is really, it's a mirror that is reflecting to us an image of ourselves. So let me just walk you through it this way.
And you have to be very, very quick because we just have a few minutes left.
So what I think is the most important lesson to learn here is that Afghanistan, in fact, is a mirror that's throwing back an image of ourselves. And by that, I mean this. In the international development world, we have a tendency to talk about, fragile or failing states or corrupt, governments. Fragile and failing. And I, in those conversations, would often say, it's deceptive because they're failing at being states, but that is not, in fact, their objective. These countries are actually run by sophisticated, multi-talented networks or cliques or coalitions, if you will, that crisscross back and forth across sectors that Americans tend to hold separate in their minds, the public sector and the private sector, even the out and out criminal sector. But what the networks do is they'll have personnel who serve in public office for a while, and then they serve in the private sector, and then their cousin may be drug running or weapons smuggling. And so they are failing at governing, but they're unbelievably successful at enriching themselves. Now, I would just like us as Americans to think for a minute. Let's think about the McMansions that have sprung up around Washington, D.C. over the past 2 decades. Let's think about the asset portfolios and the properties in New York or Miami or Houston or Los Angeles. Let's think about the art. And then let's think about the executives of, let's say, defense contracting firms, financial investment firms, pharmaceuticals, fossil fuel giants, real estate magnates.
How about former government officials and former military officials?
Well, that's right, who are cycling. You're exactly right, Dennis, and they're cycling in and out. So the executives of these companies spend some time in government and come back out. Or there are people who have spent their, several years in government who then get positions on boards of directors.
Well,
now,
yes.
Let me just ask,
right,
what policies have they promulgated or influenced? 2 lost wars, an economic meltdown that practically brought down the world economy, rampant environmental disaster that is making the world uninhabitable, and an opioid crisis that killed 700,000 Americans since 2010, a bungled response to a global pandemic. I want to say, how successful is our state?
Well, Sarah.
And I would say
Sarah,
that, yeah.
I wish we had another hour to talk about that, but I want to, because you've really hit on a very sore subject. Rebecca, just in a minute or so that we have left, give us your thoughts about what Sarah had to say and anything else you'd like to add.
In most countries I've worked in, corruption is an issue, including the city of Boston, and the fact that $2 billion was spent lobbying by the defense industry. Our Congress, I think, also reflects a problem here. The difference with Afghanistan was the volume of money, so much more money coming, not just from the US, but other countries, the level of security and the violence and conflict that was going on with the military. But just a little point, there are some remnants that are left, not the infrastructure projects, I'm sure they'll all be destroyed, but there are women who were trained to be midwives who went back to their villages and probably can save a few women giving birth. There are men, carpenters, who learned to count so they can actually measure a window and go to a store and buy the right size. There are teenage girls who are able to do extra years of school because Usaid built a wall and toilets for them. So that kind of thing is the hope that there's enough of those people out there And some of them also learn through working at the community level that they have a right and an ability to participate in their governance. So that is the hope, is that those bits that were able to be accomplished, not necessarily the big projects, but the smaller ones that working directly with people, will continue on, and those people will begin to build their own country back. So that's my hope.
I think that's what we certainly hope. But I read an article just a few days ago, and the sad thing about this, it was one of our Afghan allies, and he said this back prior to 2014 when we first started talking about truly reducing our military commitment. And he blamed the Americans for what he said, a string of catastrophic errors. Quote, "The Americans have failed to build a single sustainable institution here. All they have done is to make a small group of people very rich, and they're getting ready to go." I want to thank both of you for being with us and encourage folks to read Sarah's book. There's a lot to think about. The postmortem on Afghanistan will certainly talk about corruption, but there's a lot that we can learn, not just about what happened in Afghanistan, as Rebecca pointed out, but how our development assistance is being spent throughout the world. And as Sarah says, we do need to look into our mirror. I want to thank all of you for watching the McCuistion program. And remember, we're talking about things that matter with you, people who care.